I want to talk to you today about what, as Bruce said, is really one of the most underreported sectors and one of the most important sectors in really making America the unusual country it is. And I want to convince you that philanthropy is much more than the way it is conventionally portrayed, which is just, it's a lovely thing. It's a kind of a nice coat of paint on the American mansion. That's kind of one of the prominent views of philanthropy. And actually, I think that's grossly mistaken. I want to argue with you today that that philanthropy is a very essential part of our structure and our foundation. So let's start with some brute numbers and just kind of walk through this. I don't know if you realize our nonprofit sector now employs 11% of the entire U.S. workforce. It contributed last year 6% of GDP. And as Bruce mentioned, that does not include any of the value of volunteer labor. If you put a reasonable dollar figure per hour on the volunteer labor, that would be close to twice that. And that doesn't mean much to people, 6%. Well, trust me, that's a big number. Just to give you a little perspective here, the so-called military-industrial complex, which everybody uses as a kind of a shorthand for a big, formidable industry, the philanthropic sector passed the national defense sector in size way back in 1993 and continues to grow. So this is a big part of our economy, and it's, of course, a huge part of our culture as well. But information like this rarely makes it into journalistic discussions, into politics, into public conversations. And as a result, many citizens really have no clue how important philanthropy is to keeping our nation healthy. When I first got into the business, I sort of realized this gross under-provision of intellectual resources and perspective. First I was depressed, and then I said, okay, we can do something about that. So we launched this project to produce this book, and it was about a 3-year effort, really. And there's all kinds of sections in here. There's, for instance, a Philanthropist Hall of Fame where we have profiles of the great donors through history. There are about 1,000 separate little case histories of the most important achievements of American philanthropy from 1636 to this year. And these are organized by sections. So if you want to look at what are the most important achievements in medical philanthropy, or the most important achievements in educational philanthropy, or in arts and culture, those are all separately listed. There's a whole bunch of important statistics. There's a rich collection of quotations, all kinds of basic information that you really ought to have at your fingertips if you want to be armed and dangerous in this area. And though it sounds like, I'm sure, like an encyclopedia to you, I promise it's a very lively collection of Americana, just because there's so many interesting people and so many interesting topics and areas that pop up throughout it. Seattle pops up throughout the book. You'll not be surprised to hear. I think there are something like 10 entries that touch on philanthropic work coming out of this city. And I promise, the book will not make you snooze. If you have young children at home and they happen to open its covers, they will not come screaming and crying to you. It really is full of human interest. And I want to try to convince you that by introducing you to a few of the characters, like this guy. This is Ned McElhaney. McElhaney was born and raised in a Louisiana bayou, although you're probably doubting that when you see the way he's dressed. But he had one of those Forrest Gump lives where he did all kinds of crazy things over a period of years. And at this point, he was actually an explorer in Alaska, where he did some very remarkable things, actually, during that period. He came home and he wrote one of the classic books on alligators. He wrote a book on wild turkeys. He banded something like 250,000 birds personally as an ornithologist. He was one of the world's experts in bamboo. Don't ask me why. But he's just one of those guys that had a million interests and all kinds of appetites and just chased everything to the ground that he took an interest in. Here he is, all grown up. At this point, I'm sure he's paying, he's buying life insurance and paying down his mortgage and doing all those responsible things that men do when they take off their furs and put on their bow ties, because Ned McElhaney had a day job, which was manufacturing and selling the hot pepper condiment invented by his family. This is the business. And if you don't think there's money in burning people's tongues, you better think again. And Ned used his profits for a really amazing array of good works. For one thing, he got very attached to a fellow native of the Louisiana bayous, the snowy egret. And there was an absolute craze when McElhaney was young. I don't know what the modern analog would be. I don't know enough about fashion, but it's something like, Coach handbags or Jimmy Choo shoes or all those things that women beat up each other to get at first. And the craze was for hats with egret feathers in them, okay? I'll give you an example here. This is one here. And, I look at this and I think that's pretty fetching. I can understand why people would go crazy over that. But trust me, there were all kinds of other versions that were totally indefensible. But this is actually the feathers here. I don't know what that is up there, but these are the feathers. And so, obviously, this is a silly fashion, but it had a really unsilly effect, which was making the snowy egret almost extinct. And when he realized this, McElhaney swung into action. The philanthropist inside his breast just decided to do something about it. So his family owned an island, still owns an island down in Louisiana, and he went out and literally beat the bushes in this island and found, over a 2-day period, it took him 2 days to find 2 nests. That's all he could find. And these nests contained 8 baby egrets. And he picked them up and literally stuffed them in the pockets of his hunting jacket and went back home. And then he raised these babies in a protected area over a period of years. And by 1911, he had built up a population of about 100,000 egrets in his private refuge. Same time he was doing that, he recruited some of his philanthropist friends like John Rockefeller and Olivia Sage and others to buy up some of the swampy land in southern Louisiana that was important as winter habitat of the snowy egret. And in this way, he almost single-handedly rescued a really magnificent creature that had been on the verge of disappearing from Earth. Among many other things McElhaney did, there's another one that's got this same theme of extinction, so I'll tell you about it. He, as I told you, he was a Southern boy, and he grew up with Negro spirituals in his ears, just loved spirituals. And so far as I can tell, it was sometime around his 60th birthday. He noticed that he just wasn't hearing them anymore. And when he'd ask people if they'd sing them, no one remembered the words or knew the music. You gotta remember, they were part of an oral tradition. They were handed down from generation to generation of slaves, completely orally, had never been written down. And when McElhaney realized that these songs were at risk of dying out, he, again, took action immediately with both his checkbook and, as in the case of the egret, with his personal action. The first thing he did was he found in his local area, a lot of philanthropy is local, you'll notice this theme as I proceed this evening. He found right in his neighborhood these 2 elderly women who remembered lots of those old spirituals. They remembered the music and the harmonies and the lyrics. And so McElhaney hired a musicologist, and these 2 men sat down and asked these ladies to sing their hearts out. And as fast as they could scribble, they wrote down, verbatim, in scrupulous detail, exactly the words and the music of these artifacts, really is what they are, artifacts of American culture and history, just as they've been handed down through the generations. He then published all these books, these songs as a book, which became a classic of the genre. I'm sorry about the crummy photo, but it's a very old, very rare book at this point. There are 125 spirituals in this book, okay? I actually went to some trouble to try to figure out how many of those were ever recorded anywhere else and would have survived anywhere. As best I can tell, about 5 or 6, were protected anywhere other place. And the other 120, you can be pretty sure you wouldn't know about today if he hadn't gone to the trouble of preserving them. And by the way, one of the ones he saved is the one that Martin Luther King Jr. quoted in his very most famous passage when he talked about free at last, thank God Almighty. That's a beautiful song, by the way. It's been recently re-recorded. And that's, again, one of the songs that Ned McElhaney helped live on for all of us. Another, that's a funny reaction. I don't know what's going on there. Sorry. Another red-blooded American philanthropist, which I can't fix. I wish I could. Well, anyway, who helped keep, people lastingly free in this country is a guy named Alfred Loomis, and you can see a great picture of his necktie there. So trust me, he's a real human being, and he just loved science. That was his thing, right from early boyhood. But when he was in college, his father died, and he decided he better figure out how to make enough money to support his family. So he went to law school, ended up hating that, and decided he wanted to get back into science, but that this was going to take a fortune. He needed to make an independent fortune to do science on the level he wanted to do it. So he and his brother-in-law founded this firm. To make a really fascinating story much shorter, they basically financed much of the rural electrification of America, which was the fiber optic craze of its day, and made a lot of money that way. Then he brilliantly anticipated the stock market meltdown in 1929, got completely out of the market. It was all cash before the meltdown came, and then bought like crazy afterwards. Anyway, by the early 1930s, he was one of the richest men in America. Instantly retired from finance and put all of his time and most of his money into science, and set up a private lab, actually. Literally bought the house down the street in this little suburb of New York City he lived in, and set up one of the world's great laboratories, better than most any university had, and started inviting scientists from other countries and from across the U.S. to come join him and work with him there. And he was not a dabbler. He did some really important work in like precise measurement of time was one of his specialties. He was one of the first guys to measure and categorize brain waves while you're sleeping. Wave theory in general was something he did a lot of work on. Anyway, in 1938, Alfred Loomis visited Berlin. And two things really struck him. One is how popular Hitler was, and the other was how good the German scientists were. And he came home very disturbed. He was convinced that war was brewing and that science was going to have a lot to do with who won. So he didn't write a letter to his congressman. He didn't, call some bureau. He said, I can do something about this, and I'm going to try to do something about it. So he scrambled around and he conferred with colleagues, and he tried to think what scientific applications might have important wartime use. And he quickly settled on using radio waves to detect moving objects. And he very quickly became the national leader on what we now call radar. And not only mastered the basic science, but also started almost instantly producing very practical radar sets that could be put in airplanes and in ships. And FDR said that other than Winston Churchill, there's no civilian who did more to win World War II than Alfred Loomis. Really important contribution. I don't know if you realize how serious the U-boat threat was in the beginning of World War II, or what would have happened in the Battle of Britain if there had not been radar on the Allies' side. So this was really seminal, important research. And by the way, there were all kinds of government agencies that were supposed to be doing that, but just didn't get it done. And that's another long story that's in the book. I don't have time to get into it. Really fascinating. His particular method. He had a very specific method that he used to kind of cut to the chase and get around all the red tape. Anyway, he, like I say, really managed to make a difference. And just to kind of put a cherry on top, by the way, so I'm all the way through this really fascinating research and saying to myself, how come I never knew this guy's name? How come nobody understands that private philanthropy can be important, even in a sector as apparently devoted to the government and controlled by the government as national defense? So I was just enthralled by this research. And then I find out at the very end, the cherry on top is that he not only left behind this really interesting method of entrepreneurial philanthropy, but he also left behind a flesh and blood embodiment of this style. His great-grandson is this guy. I don't know if anyone recognizes that face. That is Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, and who, of course, is an absolutely brilliant businessman. He's disrupted, 3 separate industries by my count. I don't know if you realize he's also a very profound philanthropist himself. He is one of the leading progenitors of charter schools. So very much in the family tradition here. Another entrepreneurial philanthropist who put deep imprints on America was this man. That is George Eastman, who was the founder of Kodak and the man who really popularized photography in the early 1900s. And you got to remember, when he began, the whole photographic process was all art and no science. They really didn't have any idea how it worked. It was just kind of this big black box. And, Kodak was a classic startup. In the early days, Eastman literally hung a hammock in the corner of the warehouse where all the industrial work was taking place and slept there half the time. And, the usual frantic 24/7 operation. And at one point, all of the photos that were being sent in by people started coming out black, just a complete calamity. And they had no idea why. And you can imagine this would have killed the company in short order if it continued. So Eastman's frantic to uncover the source of this. And they finally figured out that what had happened is the industrial gelatin that's used in the photographic process comes from boiling down the carcasses of cows. I don't know if you realize that's where gelatin comes from, but that's where it comes from. Anyway, these cows had been moved to new pastures where the forage that they were eating, the grass, had a little bit less elemental sulfur. And that tiny bit of disruption of the chemistry was enough to ruin the very delicate photographic process. So when Eastman figured this out, he said, never again. I'm not going to be a prisoner of that kind of capricious fate. I'm going to figure out the basic chemistry of photography so I can kind of be the master of my own ship here. And so he started hiring chemists. And he went to an obscure little school in New England known as Boston Tech. And he had some very good experiences with people he hired out of Boston Tech. And grateful for the well-trained minds that he came to rely on, he later, as a philanthropist, funded the transformation of Boston Tech into today's MIT. He built the entire campus where MIT now sits, including this library. He really is, to a large degree, responsible for the emergence of MIT as the great research institution that it is today. Now, another factor in philanthropy that's terribly important and that I really emphasize in the Almanac is passion. And I've learned it's never a good idea to get between a donor and his or her passion. And Eastman's a classic example of this. He had this huge passion for music. There's all these great stories. I mean, at one point, he and a friend went to New York City, and they took in 12 operas in 6 days. And there's this great entry in her journal where she says, George is absolutely alcoholic about music, which is really true. He literally had a full-size pipe organ installed in his home, and he hired a guy to come over every morning and play toccatas and fugues, and that's how he woke up. That was his alarm clock, literally. So he had this huge passion. He'd say, well, that's kind of sweet, kind of quirky, kind of weird, but whatever. But he translated that passion into a very concrete and important accomplishment. That passion for music led Eastman to create one of the really great gifts in American cultural history, which was to will into existence the Eastman School of Music at the University of Rochester, which was really important in doing two things to classical music: Americanizing classical music and popularizing classical music. I mean, in his day, if you wanted to become a conductor, you really had to go to Europe. There was no alternative, or a concertmaster, or an opera diva, or anything else. And a lot of that changed because of what Eastman started at his music school. The other thing that happened, by the way, in this auditorium, this is the main auditorium of the Eastman School. The other thing that happened here was this is the first place where we began to see glimmers that film could be more than just a kind of a cheap and vulgar entertainment, which is all it was in those days, and could potentially be an art form. That all really began here. Even hired orchestras to play between the reels of silent films and stuff, and really kind of changed the course of that business as well. And of course, the Eastman School remains a really great cultural institution today. Another very idiosyncratic donor who poured money into world-changing research was Catherine McCormick. And by the way, I only noticed, look at this picture. I don't know why these pictures are getting cut off, but I only noticed after I put this in my slideshow that she's wearing egret feathers, I'm pretty sure. So we have dueling philanthropists here. Catherine McCormick was the reaper of the International Harvester Fortune. That was her money, okay? And she was an early women's rights activist. And I have to tell you, she was more than a little bit crazy, but she was very determined, and she really wanted to make a difference in the world, and got being about it somewhere along the way that the quest she really wanted to go on was to find a way of controlling fertility that would be as easy as taking a daily aspirin. That was the assignment she gave herself. And she managed to find a crazy but brilliant biologist who had been thrown out of Harvard named Gregory Pincus, and the two of them formed an alliance, and she put, by my calculations, about $20 million of her own money into this quest to fund a daily birth control pill. And I don't mean she gave it to some university that distributed it, or I don't mean she had other helpers. She was the sole and entire funder and creator of this product. And by 1957, she and her partner had an FDA-approved pill. And I don't have to tell you, that changed the world. And certainly was something that she took pleasure from. There's a great story, in fact, at one point. So she's just really excited about this accomplishment. So she has a prescription written out for herself in her own name, and she takes it to her local pharmacy and gets it filled, even though at this point she's a matron in her 80s. So kind of superfluous, but I guess it was a thrill. People don't realize that the Ford Foundation was at one point centered in Southern California, and during that time, a writer named Dwight McDonald described the Ford Foundation as, quote, a large body of money completely surrounded by people who want some. And you look at a big place like Ford or some of these wealthy moguls I've been describing, and you think, well, that's philanthropy, isn't it? That's what American philanthropy is all about. Actually, it's not. Philanthropy in the U.S. is not just a story of moguls. It's not even primarily about wealthy people, and least of all is it about foundations. I'm going to show you the statistics here. This is for the latest year of giving, and I want you to note that only 14% of all the money given away last year was given by foundations, and only 5% came from corporations. And the rest, 81%, came from individuals. And most of that came from everyday families at the rate of about $2,500 per family. And you multiply that by 100 some odd million households, and you get a big iceberg underneath that tip that we all see, which is the moguls. Now, this is a really crucial reality that I think is important not to overlook. So I do some extended storytelling in the Almanac about some of these real-life givers. And there's some beautiful stories. This is Gus and Marie Selensky. Sorry about the bad photo, but this is the only one that exists. Gus was a plumber, and Marie was a nurse in Syracuse, New York, near where I grew up. And they lived quietly in a small house there. Their one big hoo-ha indulgence was square dancing. I think they got their square dancing gear on in that picture. And other than that, they were savers. very kind of hard workers and quiet savers. And when they died a few years ago, they left more than $3 million to good causes. Ann Scheiber was a shy auditor who retired in 1944 with a grand total of $5,000 in the bank. And she also was very thrifty and apparently an inspired stock picker, because by the time she died at the age of 101, she had $22 million in the bank. And she left every penny of that to Yeshiva University so that poor girls could go to college and to medical school. Eleanor Sauerwein was, kind of everyone's grandma. She, again, was very thrifty liver. She painted her own house, and she had a vegetable garden, and she mowed her own lawn until she was in her 90s to save money. Her financial advisor reported that, quote, her goal for years and years was to amass as much as she could so that she could give it to the Salvation Army. And when Eleanor died in 2011, she left $1.7 million to the Modesto, California branch of the Salvation Army. This guy is interesting. Albert Lexie shined shoes for a living. That's what he did for about 50 years, just recently retired. And he made a decision, I don't know why, but in 1981, he decided he was going to donate all his tips to what was called the Free Care Fund of the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. And over the years, he handed over more than $200,000 to this fund as a shoeshine guy, which is about a third of his total earnings. Now, sometimes when I tell these stories, and there's lots more, some of them are in the book and some of them are just, I didn't have room for it, but sometimes when I tell these stories, people say, well, those are very lovely stories, Karl, but, nothing large or consequential is ever going to come out of that kind of giving. And I'm here to tell you that the verdict of American history is that those doubters are very wrong. All kinds of remarkable things have been achieved by what I would call dispersed giving, which you have to remember aggregates, all right? A lot of people do little things, and it aggregates in very formidable ways. And let me give you an example of that. I was reading a book by Daniel Borstein. Some of you may know Daniel Borstein used to be the Librarian of Congress, and he had a figure that just stopped me in my tracks. So he was talking about Ohio in 1880, all right? And he said in 1880, the state of Ohio had 3 million residents, 3 million people. At that same exact year, the nation of England, or the country of England, had 23 million people, far more. Ohio had 37 colleges that year. England had a grand total of 4. Very striking. So I asked myself instantly, what's going on there? And the answer basically is small-scale education philanthropy. Let me show you the map of Ohio. I picked 1826 just because that's the year the Case Western Reserve was founded. Some of you probably know that's become quite a wonderful university. They've had something like 16 Nobel Prize winners come out of there, and a lot of companies you would have heard of. It's a very formidable science and math university especially. So that was the year Case Western was founded. And despite its prominence today, Case Western in 1826 was a spot on the back of nowhere. I mean, you have to remember, this was the West in those days. This was the frontier. And so who was founding these colleges? Basically, it was sacrificial giving from very small, very low-income farmers that did this. And there's some really beautiful stories. There's this one tale about a guy. It was a farmer who had several teams of horses and wagons that he didn't need during the winter. So that was his contribution to Western Reserve. He would haul stone from the local quarry to the campus all winter. That's what he did. And a bunch of other local families set aside a portion of their egg money, all right, or their milk money. And that was their contribution to the university. And, I sometimes hear people talk about world-class this and world-class that, and I think to myself, I bet they wouldn't think much of the egg money. But you know what? Egg money can add up, and egg money can do powerful things, which is certainly what happened in this case. The notion of these local neighbors was that America's a democracy. We need an educated citizenry. And even in the middle of nowhere, you need institutions that will make that happen. And we can do it ourselves. Now, in the 1840s, a bunch of Eastern churches, hundreds of Eastern churches, got wind of this, that this was going on, not only in Ohio, but in lots of the frontier states, that these local residents and farmers were really putting out big time to try to build some of these colleges. And they wanted to help. These Eastern churches wanted to help. So they started pooling donations together, right? And you can imagine, these were probably nickels and dimes that they were collecting. But they collected these little donations, and they pooled them together, and they started sending them west in a very methodical program. And they selected 18 colleges that they wanted to nurture, and they sent about $1 million west over a period of years. And let me show you the map of Ohio. After that campaign had been going on about 25 years. This is what Ohio looked like in 1872. And you can see there's just this bloom of institutions, many of which have become quite important in our nation's kind of progress And this same story could be told about tons of other states. I just picked Ohio because I had the data, okay? You could make this same point elsewhere. Now I want you to fast forward to 2015. You know, it's easy to get jaded about this stuff, but we have to not lose our capacity to be amazed that there are 50 separate colleges today that are in the middle of a fundraising campaign where they're going to collect $1 billion of private voluntary donations. And there are probably another 50 that just finished a campaign within the last 5 years, and there are a bunch that are going to start $1 billion campaigns in the future. My point is there is a huge gush of private money that has basically made our universities the envy of the world that they are today. And by the way, this is true not only of private colleges, but of public universities. I was just down in California, and the numbers for Berkeley, UCal Berkeley now gets more money from private donors than they do from the state of California. I did the same calculation for the University of Virginia. They get about twice as much from philanthropy as they do from the state of Virginia. So even at our public universities, this is a big, important source of influence. Now, going back to those stories about the farmers in Western Reserve, there's one of the points there is how personal a lot of American giving is. Always has been, always will be, I think. Very personal. These are often intimate gifts and really heartfelt. And I want to kind of dig in a little bit on that theme a little further. And I want to dig in real deep, in fact, with this guy. What in the world is going on with my slides? I'm so sorry about this. You're getting a great view of the bellies of all of my protagonists. Well, this is a really sweet man, too. It's a shame that I can't get it working for you. But he, anyway, this is a Broadway lyricist named Michael Brown. And, you know, I've been a freelance writer enough years to appreciate what a lyricist goes through. It's a boom and bust business. I mean, once in a while you get lucky. Most of the time you're starving. But in 1956, the Brown family got lucky. He had a hit musical, all right? So they were flush. They had a lot more resources than they expected to have. And he and his wife and their 2 boys decided that for their Christmas celebration that year, they wanted to invite a local starving artist who was a friend of theirs to come share Christmas with them. So they had this woman who was a long way from her home in the South come spend Christmas with them. And toward the end of their gift exchange, they handed her an envelope. And inside this envelope was a note that very simply said, "You have 1 year off from your job to write whatever you please." And the writer's name was Harper Lee. And you'll remember, Harper Lee was from Mississippi. And when she decided she wanted to be a novelist, she moved to New York City, which is what tons of novelists have done before and since. And what happens to most of them when they get in New York City? They're so darn busy trying to pay the rent that they make no progress whatever on their art. That's a very common phenomenon. In Harper Lee's case, she was working at an airline and at a bookstore, all right, and just not doing any writing because she was so frantic trying to keep her head above water. The Browns noticed this. All right, they noticed this. They viewed her as someone with potential, as a possible resource, and someone who needed help. And they had resources, and they decided to act. Now, some people would say, "Is that philanthropy?" I would say, yeah, that's philanthropy. It's a very intimate, very personal form of philanthropy, but it's philanthropy in my definition, at least. And with their donation in hand, and Lee debated whether to accept it. She was very moved, but very kind of torn. But she decided she would accept it. So she retired from that airline job and that bookstore job, and she spent the next year writing, and that was the gift year. That gift year is when she produced Mockingbird, which of course won the Pulitzer Prize in 1961 and became one of the most influential American books of all time. Obviously, books like Mockingbird are stuffed away in public libraries like this. This is the main reading room of the New York Public Library. I assume a lot of you know public libraries are a complete invention of philanthropy. And it was 4 families who got the New York Public Library going. You know, every city had pretty much the same story. It was Joshua Bates who kicked off the public library in Boston. It was Enoch Pratt who did it in Baltimore. You know, we all know about Carnegie. These are basically fruits of philanthropy. And today, something like 1.5 billion people, there are about 1.5 billion visits to libraries, public libraries in this country every year. For me, a lot of the beauty and the power of philanthropy derives from the huge range of causes that people underwrite. And there's a whole, I mean, Bruce alluded to this, there's a whole definitional question. Is that philanthropy? Is this philanthropy? I really am careful about diving in on that. I think we have to sort of tolerate a very broad range of choices when it comes to what people want to do with their donations. And for reasons I'll get into in a minute. But in the meantime, let me just try to illustrate to you a little bit about how broad that range is. For instance, I don't know if you realize that many of our national parks are basically were created by donors. This is Acadia in Maine. That was product of philanthropy. The Virgin Islands National Park, the Grand Tetons, the Great Smoky, all of these were sparked by donors. Private supporters have also been at the center of some really miraculous recoveries of endangered species. Again, I'm not sure many people realize that. This is the peregrine falcon, one of my favorite creatures. When they're flying, a lot of you probably know, the peregrine falcon is the fastest animal on Earth. When they are breeding, they are snails. They are really not very effective breeders for whatever reason. And so for a while, they were flirting with extinction. This is basically the 60s and 70s, I guess. And all kinds of government biologists tried to fix this. There were a whole variety of programs. Nobody had any luck. They were just kind of teetering and dwindling and dwindling. Then along came a grant from this really weird, odd couple. I'd love to know the origins of this. But the IBM Corporation, right, Mr. Button Down, and a whole bunch of falconry hobbyists, the people who wear the leather gloves and they fly the birds off their gloves. IBM and falconry hobbyists, if there's a weirder marriage anywhere in philanthropy, I don't know of it, but they got together and they provided not only money, but lots of very fresh, very unconventional ideas as to how the peregrine might be restored. And one of the things they came up with was peregrines love heights and they love pigeons. Where would you put nesting boxes if you were going to try to revive the peregrine? How about up on top of skyscrapers? That's the kind of thing that government biologists get fired for saying or for trying or for doing or for wasting taxpayer money on. It turned out to be a brilliant idea. There are peregrines living on skyscrapers all across this country. I'm sure there's some in Seattle. And the birds are out of danger at this point. So this is the kind of cutting edge, crazy sometimes invention that philanthropy is very good at. And by the way, it's not just this one animal. There's all kinds of awesome stories. I don't have time to tell them now, but they're in the book. The wolf has a really fascinating sub-story about philanthropy's importance in making it possible for them to come back. The bluebird was a classic grassroots philanthropy. I mean, totally bottom-up, driven by lots of little old ladies and people putting boxes out in their backyards. The wild turkey, this might sound like an oxymoron to you, but it was hunters who brought back the wild turkey when they were almost gone. The whooping crane is an absolutely, I can't even begin to tell you what a cool story this is. I mean, not only, there were a couple of philanthropists, but one guy in particular not only got heavily involved in using his own private plane to fly eggs down, whooping crane eggs down from Alaska and Canada and bring them to the U.S., but then they realized, you know what, they're living here now, but they don't know how to migrate. And you have to teach them. You have to show them once how to do it. Once they've done it once, they can do it again. But the first time, they haven't a clue what to do. So how do you fix that one? Well, there's not only crackpot ideas. The guy, he was a private pilot, this donor. So he said, how about if we got one of those little, powered hang gliders and just led them down to Florida and Louisiana? It sounds crazy, but that's exactly what they did, and it worked. So there's all these really wonderful stories in this area. I must say, when I got into this research, I had no idea how deeply entwined philanthropy is with science in general, all kinds of science. I mean, you guys are younger than me, most of you, but when I was growing up, we all learned about the Mount Wilson telescopes and the Mount Palomar telescope and the Keck telescope and all these. I remember these names vividly. I had no idea that every single one of those was filled with light by private philanthropy. And that, by the way, continues to be the case today. The two really incredible instruments that are under construction today in that area are the so-called 30-meter telescope and the Giant Magellan telescope, which is a similar instrument that's going to be in the southern hemisphere. 30-meter, for instance, can collect 9 times as much light as the biggest instrument available today. This is going to revolutionize parts of science when it goes to work. Really wonderful things are going to happen or be learned. And both of those new instruments are being built today thanks to private donors. In the case of the 30-meter telescope, which you see here, it was Gordon Moore, who is the founder of Intel Corporation, who plunked down $250 million to get it designed and kicked off. And lots of other donors have been involved in that as well. Another area you might not appreciate the importance of philanthropy is overseas assistance. This is the latest number for the latest year for which we have numbers. And you'll see here that private donations to poor people living overseas very much exceed, at $39 billion, the entire sum of our government overseas aid at $31 billion. So you can see this is kind of grassroots giving. And that pattern of grassroots action to solve problems leads me to this really great kind of, $50 word that it sounds a little intimidating first, but I'm trying to get people to use it because it's a really wonderful term. Polyarchy. Polyarchy refers to a society where there are many sources of power, many sources of authority. And the easy way to remember is to contrast it to monarchy. All right, that's kind of the opposite. Polyarchy is the opposite of monarchy. So Again, many independent sources of power. And the U.S. has a notably polyarchic culture. I mean, if you're interested in technology, it's a good chance you're going to be in Seattle or Northern California. If you're, on the other hand, a banker, you might be in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's ground zero for banking. If you're in the energy sector, you're going to be in Houston. If you love rock and roll, you might live in Minneapolis until you die. But so there's all kinds of power centers scattered all across the country. And that might seem normal to you, but if any of you have lived abroad, it's not normal in most places. If you're in France, for instance, I don't care if it's education or finance or arts and culture or any other sector, you have to be in Paris, pretty much. It's certainly true in Japan. I mean, Tokyo is the center of the universe for almost all the industries and businesses. That's not the case here, right? We have a much more fractured, distributed power and authority all across the country. I think it's very healthy for us. And I want to tell you that I think philanthropy has a lot to do with this. I mean, here's a little metaphor I'll give you that you can hold in your minds maybe. I think of sometimes of those millions of givers all across the country and those tens of thousands of nonprofit groups as like mini legislatures. That's really what they are. And they, like any legislature, look around them and say, what's broken in our area? What needs fixing? What do people not like? What needs repair? And then they go to work. They collect funds and they organize themselves and they go to work to try to fix things. And sometimes it's really micro. It might be somebody in this neighborhood thinks that this street needs a nice set of trees up and down it, and they raise money to plant trees along the sidewalk. It can be simple, it can be big, but those are basically what that is that's spontaneous governance, self-governance. That's another big difference between our country and other countries. There is, countries that had a peasant class for a long time, I think got ingrained the idea that governance is something somebody else gives you, and you consume governance, right? That's what average people do. In our country, people sometimes consume governance, but there's also this notion that everyday average people can produce governance. They can actually become the government, if you will, themselves by fixing things on their own. I mean, I grew up in a small town, and I'm sure some of you had the same experience. When we had a bad storm and a tree blew down in the street, we didn't call a fire department. We didn't call the Department of Public Works. We got out our chainsaws, and we cut it up and we moved it away. That's what you do. You just fix it. That's what Americans are kind of habituated to do. We've been doing it since the beginning of our country. As Bruce mentioned, this was very, very, really struck Alexis de Tocqueville. He was very convinced that this was at the heart of really the American experiment. And to Tocqueville, it actually was very interesting. He said all this kind of self-governance doesn't just reflect democracy. He said this creates democracy. This causes democracy. This is how you build up the muscles that make you a democracy. You don't just, you have to practice. You have to somehow get started on the idea of taking responsibility first for your family, then for your neighborhood, then for the ring that's outside that, then for the ring that's outside that. And we often do that in civil associations and in our private philanthropy. And it's really a healthy impulse. A Yale Law School professor I admire, a guy named Stephen Carter, points out that when you have millions of charitable decisions taking place, that leads to obviously much more diverse spending, much better protection of minority points of view, and much more kind of modulated to each location solutions, which are often going to be much more effective. So he refers to philanthropy as democracy in action. It's a great term, I think. And so you ask yourself, well, if all that's true, Karl, why do so few people understand that? Why do so few people appreciate that? Why don't I not see more of this taking place? And the answer is because philanthropy is by definition mostly going to be invisible. First of all, it's very local. I have no idea what's going on in Cleveland. Most of you have no idea what's going on in Cleveland. There's a lot of stuff going on in Cleveland, right? Philanthropy is often very private. A lot of people don't really want to publicize it. There are religious injunctions against publicizing what you're doing here. A lot of people want to be anonymous. So you miss this. You don't see this. And that's why, I don't know, Bruce has the magazine. Hold up the magazine, Bruce. That's why I put on the cover of this issue where this is kind of the Cliff Notes version of the Almanac, by the way. If you want a short 20-page read of what's in the Almanac, that's what this magazine is all about. That's why I put an anthill. This is underground. You walk over this anthill and you don't realize there are tens of thousands of creatures underneath your feet, hard at work, doing stuff, out of sight, but really doing important things. And that's a good metaphor, I think, for the way philanthropy works. So you have to have a little faith. You have to have the imagination to understand that there is all this grassroots activity taking place, and just because it doesn't have a bureau and it doesn't have a czar at the head of it and it doesn't have a fleet of trucks, with blue and white paint, doesn't mean that there isn't an army out there that's taking action, solving problems. And there are lots of reasons that philanthropy kind of gets criticized because of a lack of appreciation of this. I mean, people talk about how philanthropy is not coordinated. I hear this all the time. Philanthropy is really scattershot. Over here the rules are one way, and over here they're a different way, and it's not consistent. It's not standardized. And I kind of understand that. There's a certain cast of mind. I have to fight this kind of Prussian side of my personality once in a while that wants to have everything kind of uniform. But that's really, that's not the way. That's not the way human beings work. Human beings don't respond well to uniform solutions. They really like customized solutions, and philanthropy is very good at customizing. The government is good at standardizing. They are good at getting everyone marching in the same direction. That's what government does, and there's a place for that in certain things. If you want to, make sure that 70-year-old people have checks to rely on, that's a pretty standardized rote operation. You can have the government do that. But if you want to actually fix some complicated problem, how do you figure out when elderly people get sent out of the hospital, a lot of them forget to take their medicines, and so they're re-hospitalized 3 weeks later? How do you fix that? That's a lot harder. That takes some customization. That takes some personal touch. That takes some mentoring. That takes some human interest. That's a great task for philanthropy. Leave the check writing to the government computers. Do the other stuff via philanthropy. I think we're getting better, a little bit better at understanding this. I mean, my 90-year-old mom, this is a hard field for people to understand. About twice a year, she calls me up and she says, "So, philanthropy, now, is that Plato and Socrates or is that stamp collecting? I'm trying to remember here." And I said, "No, Mom, that's not quite right." But this whole idea, a lot of younger people who grew up in the middle of the computer revolution, I think they understand. I'll give you an example. There's this great term, this has become a term of art. Everyone knows what crowdsourcing is. What's crowdsourcing? Lots of little people taking small bites out of a big problem, and you shut your eyes, and 10 minutes later you look up, or 10 days later you look up, and that big problem was fixed. And it was just a bunch of little average people who did it. How did Wikipedia get written? Oh my gosh, what's going on? My mom will never get that, probably. My mom will never understand Airbnb. She thinks the Holiday Inn is the way to go. You know what you're getting, by gum, And I stayed in a tree house, an Airbnb tree house in Saratoga Springs. One of the coolest things I ever did. And I didn't tell Mom about that, But that was actually, it was a really great solution to the problem at hand. It was during horse racing season. There was nothing else available. And it was not only fun, but the alternative was to drive 50 miles. So I think we're getting better at understanding this kind of breaking problems into little pieces. As I say, the computer revolution had a lot to do with it. This is what a computer meant when I started playing with computers. I used to go with my father down to the Syracuse University computer department. We'd make punch cards to run through a big machine like this. These machines, which were half the size of this room in some cases, they had one processor, okay? All the wires led to one processor. We quickly learned that's a really inefficient way to solve problems. That's a really inefficient way to figure out anything. This is the efficient way to figure things out. Doritos and Diet Coke and all, this works. I mean, when you break problems into 1,000 pieces, this is the hacker culture at work. One man with a laptop can do a lot. Especially when there's tens of thousands of people doing the same thing. That's how, Linux, the computer language Linux got written, that runs the bank across the street and half of the commercial backbone of this country. There is no czar Linux. You just put your edits online and somebody else picks them up and they make their tinkering and they put it back online. That's literally how it's written. And I know it sounds like chaos to a lot of people, but it's very effective. We all know there's nobody in charge of making sure that Seattle never runs out of milk, but it never runs out of milk. This just happens organically. And this is the way that philanthropy works as well, organically with lots of small scale actions. So this is something we don't need to be defensive, I think, about it. When people say philanthropy is a patchwork, we need to say, great, patchworks can be really efficient and lovely things. I'll give you one last example here that I like to use. Any of you who know anything about charter schooling probably know that the big brand in charter schools, the 800-pound gorilla, is KIPP, the KIPP schools, and they do some wonderful things. And there's 183 of them. All right, sounds like a lot of schools, doesn't it? Well, then you realize there are 7,000 charter schools in the U.S., which means that the biggest of the big is a tiny dot. This is a radically decentralized industry where there are just lots and lots of mom and pop players, lots and lots of 3 and 4 school players. And what does that allow? Well, that allows us a riot of choices. If any of you have visited charter schools, or if you haven't, I encourage you to. You'll be astonished. I mean, there are great book schools. There are math and science nerd schools. There are, quasi-military academies. There are hippie schools where nobody tells you what to do about anything. And there's this huge variety. And it's obviously philanthropically driven, philanthropically backed. And I argue that it really reflects human needs. I mean, those of you who are raising kids know that the most humbling thing that ever happens to you is you realize how little effect you have on who your kids are. They're kind of wired. And you have to find institutions that match them. The school that was right for my eldest son was not right for my middle daughter. And you really need to have that range of possibilities. It's very hard to do through government institutions. It's easy to do through philanthropy. So that's a kind of a Rorschach test for me. When people look at these kind of numbers and they say, what a crazy quilt mess that is. No consistency, no uniformity, rules all over the place. I say, yeah, that's right. And what's the problem? Because there are lots of places where really what you want is not a system. You want an ecosystem, right? You want a whole range of options. And that's becoming a truism, like in business even. We know that that's the way businesses are increasingly operated. I'm staying in the Arctic Club. I can't quite tell who owns it. It's like Arctic Club, and then there's DoubleTree, and then there's the Hilton. But it used to be, there was the Hilton. There was one hotel. Now there's all these kind of subsets of the Hilton world. They've kind of customized and modified and changed their offerings to meet the variety of public appetites and interests. So let me close with, just so you don't think I'm a crazy romantic, by acknowledging that not all donors are saints, all right? That's really important to get on the record. You are looking here at J. Paul Getty, who was one of the world's great cheapskates. When he was literally, I think, the richest man in the world, he installed a payphone at his estate and made his guests start paying for their own calls. Some of you might remember there was a period where his grandson got kidnapped for ransom, and it was a $17 million ransom. And so Grandpa got on the phone. He's like, can you get that down a little bit? That's a little high. Could we reduce that? And to the point where finally the kidnappers cut off the grandson's ear and mailed it to Grandpa to try to get his attention. And at that point he said, okay, I'll pay. But he only paid, get this, he paid as much of the ransom as was tax deductible. Why any is tax deductible, I have no idea. But apparently $2.2 million were tax deductible, so he just paid that outright. And the rest he gave to his son to pay off as a loan at 4% interest. So this is the kind of man we're talking about. Not a real warm, fuzzy human being. But, here's the kicker. I mean, this is also the guy who gave the world's most sublime collection of Greek and Roman art to people so that they can walk in and view this. And for hundreds of years from now, there will be people getting their souls elevated thanks to J. Paul Getty giving this to the world. So it's true. Philanthropists aren't always pretty, but the really important thing you have to keep in mind is they don't need to be saints. They don't need to be angels. That's the brilliance of the mechanism, is it takes all of us as we are. And we all have a little J. Paul Getty in us. We got some generous impulses, we have some selfish impulses, and we got all these confusions and everything swirling around inside of us. And philanthropy can deal with that. It can work with that. It can take that and find your best self and either encourage or cajole or maybe shame or otherwise get you to do good things for your fellow citizens, even with our obvious flaws. So I'm going to quit there. And, I've only just skimmed the book. It's kind of criminal, actually. But I hope I've given you enough to kind of convince you that philanthropy is just a huge and really fascinating and powerful aspect of our culture. And I hope you'll read through the book and kind of absorb some of this yourself. And the next time somebody tries to tell you that philanthropy is a cute hobby or just a kind of a nice national sideline, I hope you'll think to yourself, I don't think so. I think it's really much more than that. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions or anything else.
We have a question right here.
Can you hear me? What do you see as the challenges of philanthropy in the 21st century? I know you talked about the internet, how that's made things easier, but then we have challenges like we rely much more on the Department of whatever to take care of our problems with the government. So as a government employee, I'm kind of wondering what you see as kind of the obstacles in this next century.
Well, that's just a function of modern life, is that there is this statist impulse abroad today, which really wants to kind of hand everything over to one of these standardized agencies, which again has a superficial appeal, but I think it'd be a real tragedy. not so much, partly just because the two sectors operate in such different ways. I mean, I'm not opposed to having an intelligent and active state. I think you need that for some things, but they aren't interchangeable. They're radically different. Let me give you a quick example from medical research. What would you guess is the average age of first grant from the government to medical researchers? The answer is 43 years old is when the average person gets his very first grant from NIH or NSF. That is criminal. I mean, you are a geezer in any kind of scientific field by the time you're 43. What's going on there? Well, what's going on there is it's basically a cover your ass kind of function of government people. If you want to, kind of be safe, you find someone who's already become prominent at Harvard and you give them a grant. That's completely risk-free. It's also dumb as dirt. I mean, it's just not the way you cultivate new ideas and innovations and fresh things. I looked up what fraction of people who get grants from the National Institutes of Health, NIH, are 35 or under. 1%. Again, that's just a crime. Philanthropists are big on those young scientists. They recognize, for whatever reason, early on, that's the place to put your money. That's the place to bet. And yeah, you miss sometimes. You bet on somebody who falls asleep or didn't have a good idea in the first place or goes off and runs away with their lab assistant or something. But you also have a much higher chance of actually, supporting some dramatic intervention, dramatic change in the world. So the sectors are radically different. Philanthropy is obviously much less risk averse. It's much more inventive. It's much more efficient. And the public understands this, by the way. One of the things in the Almanac, we have a whole section of polls. We actually did an original national poll. And people are pretty onto this. They are very trusting of philanthropy, very much recognize the ways it differs from other modes of solving problems, and really like to go there first, actually, whenever the option is available. So that's one of the quick questions about how it compares to government. As far as challenges, I mean, there's all kinds of things. There's great stuff going on. I mean, philanthropy used to be an old man's game. It was like when you were retired and you were done with your career, that's when you got going. It's not anymore. You got men and women today who are jumping in, and as you know, Zuckerberg's the latest example, right in mid-career or early career even, and investing not only their money, but their insights and their energy and their entrepreneurial instincts to try to fix things. So there's lots of good stuff like that going on. But there is this there are a couple of things going on. One thing, it's kind of unfair probably, but I call it the MBA-ification of philanthropy. There's this kind of desire to make it scientific and make it just a computer where you put in A, B, and C and you turn the crank and X, Y, Z comes out the other end. Never going to work that way. Again, this is a human undertaking. Mother Teresa had this great phrase. She said, I never think about crowds. I think about individuals. And I think most effective problem solvers for human social problems, that's the way you operate. I mean, if you're talking about the really hard nut problems, what are hard nut problems? Addictions, people getting out of prison, and how do you avoid them becoming recidivists? How do you keep people from dropping out of college? Those are hard problems, and they're at the core of a lot of other dramatic secondary problems. You're not going to fix those with anything other than very intimate, very personal, one-to-one interventions. That takes mentoring. That takes oversight. That takes personal involvement. Stuff that philanthropy can do. It's very good at. But it's a different style of operating. It's just a completely different mode of attacking the problem.
One of the things that we're most interested in at Discovery Institute is entrepreneurism. And it happens in the public policy realm as well as in the economic business realm. And it happens in philanthropy.
Yep.
What do you think are some of the most exciting? Let's give a couple examples of the most exciting entrepreneurial activities or entrepreneurs in philanthropy right now.
Good question. I'm very excited by the recognition that you don't have to do everything through a 501c3. You don't have to have a foundation. I mean, the Zuckerbergs, as you know, got criticized heavily when they said that they're going to do a lot of their work through all of their charity, through this LLC. People said, oh, then it's not real charity. It's like a secret business agenda. They're really not letting go of any of the money. I think that was very unfair and very unfortunate. And there's just all kinds of interesting innovation going on. I'll give you a little small-scale example. So, again, Philanthropy Magazine is one of the things I oversee. We have a story coming up in our next issue where we found this woman who went to Rwanda, and she learned that one of the real public health problems in Rwanda is that 80% of the families live in houses with dirt floors, right? I don't care how careful you are, how much you try to be clean, a dirt floor is never going to be sanitary. You spill food on a dirt floor, there are going to be pathogens living there. Your baby makes a mess on the dirt floor, you're never going to get that out. So you say, well, why don't they put in concrete floors or something? They can't afford it. All right, it's too expensive. So this woman went to work on this problem, and she came up with an old American technology we call Adobe, which is basically packed earth that successive layers that you pack a certain way, and then you seal it all with linseed oil. And it's almost as durable as concrete, and it's very hygienic. You can actually clean it and seal it. So it's a great solution, much cheaper, like a third of the cost of concrete. So she figured this out, and then you figure out, well, how are you going to implement this? How are you going to roll it out in those 80% of all houses that need it? She made a very interesting choice. She set up the entity that will do this as a business, as a for-profit business in Rwanda, where people make $3 a day. So you say, wasn't that kind of perverse? Isn't that kind of silly? I actually think it was brilliant. Now, the business is owned by a nonprofit, and this nonprofit has no expectation of extracting any money out of this. They're not doing it to make any money. But she knew that if it was structured as a business, it would operate differently. And for instance, one of the very first people they hired was, guess what? Was a marketer. So he goes out, his job is to go out and talk to families and convince them, you got to have this. This will change your life. This will make your baby healthier. This is a really good thing. Marketing, sales. The other thing they did, they set up installment plans. So just like you buy your vacuum cleaner in 8 installments, you can buy your Adobe floor in 6 installments. Just the little simple things that businesses know how to do that most nonprofits are clueless at. So I think that's really an exciting area where you're applying some of these practices, the management and daily operational practices of business to charitable ends. I'm very excited about that.
So one of the trends in philanthropy, particularly in the foundations right now, is collective impact and foundations seeing themselves as catalysts for community-wide change, large social change. And so some foundations see their role, instead of maybe funding a college or an opera hall or something, they're funding the convening of all the sectors in the community to come together and solve a problem. Do you see that as a good trend? Is that a useful trend?
The first thing I got to say is that I try hard, the Philanthropy Roundtable tries hard to not be too prescriptive, to try to be agnostic and say, the donors should decide these things. It's not really for the smarty pants class to be telling them how to do these things. So I think there are good things that can be done in a whole variety of ways. There have been so many surprises in philanthropy, so much serendipity, so many things that you wouldn't have expected to work out, that I'm very chary about becoming too my way or the highway, too much that there's only one way to do things. However, that said, I don't think much of that kind of collective impact. What it often becomes, Bruce mentioned that even the government can be entrepreneurial. Well, the flip side of that is that even entrepreneurs can become bureaucrats, and they do. We all have seen this happen to companies and corporations that had this wonderful, fresh, kind of vibrant streak. My son was like employee number 80 for Uber, and he was there in the cowboy days when they're like just making it up as they went along. It was all cowboys and engineers in the early days. And then when the money became obvious in Uber, then you get this big flood of people that were like well-trained at Wharton and all these big business schools, and it's a completely different culture, But so this can happen in any sector, to be fair. But I think the kind of this grouping together thing, I've seen it take place in certain sectors, and it becomes extremely bureaucratic, and it becomes all about like self-justification of the employees of the sector often, as much as it is about actually getting anything done. I'll give you one very personal example where it hits home with me. Bruce mentioned I was an embedded reporter in Iraq for a lot of times, and I developed some emotional attachment to a lot of the men and women I was with over there. So when I came back, one of the things I did was to help set up at the Roundtable a program for philanthropy for veterans and service members. And there is a big competing effort out there that is doing this collective impact stuff, and it's like, honestly, it's just kind of PR and marketing. It's a way for a big bank that has a bad public image to kind of say, by gum, we're for the boys, It really hasn't done anything. It's very disappointing. It's a kind of lowest common denominator thing. It often dumbs things down to this kind of really generic, really general stuff. The best way to get things done in philanthropy is just like, get into your niche, dive right down deep. You're the guy who's going to support hydroponic lettuce production in eastern Washington, by gum, and that's your solution to the poverty of farm families. And just go for it, That generally works best, rather than these kind of big, you're just kind of recapitulating the blob when you do that, and that's not what philanthropy is good at.
Can you tell us what percentage of that total in philanthropy total goes towards poverty reduction?
Well,
Because I mention this because my friends on the hardcore left will say, well, most of the money you cite as spent on philanthropy goes to rich people's opera houses and art collections.
that is not accurate. The first thing to say is that the biggest, and we do that data is in the book. It's in the statistics section in the back. You'll see pie charts that sort of break it all out. And I'll tell you the first cause, the biggest cause, the favorite cause of Americans is religion. And that is a kind of a rubric that covers a lot of territory. I mean, this effort in Rwanda, that's religious inspired. It's religious driven. A lot of religious philanthropy is involved in feeding people. That is anti-poverty work, but it comes in under the rubric of religion. So, but more generally, I know exactly what you're talking about. That's a real problem today. And again, I think it's terribly important to resist that and to start anointing some kinds of philanthropy as good philanthropy and some kinds as bad philanthropy. First of all, we can do both. We can do both opera houses and anti-poverty work. We do a lot of both. In fact, the fastest growing sector today is philanthropy for the poorest of the poor. I mean, people are voting with their dollars to do that. They are spending a lot of money in places like Rwanda. A lot of that's religiously motivated. A lot of that's just good humanitarian impulse. But they aren't stopping doing other things. And I am very, very reluctant to say that if you want to help school kids in Seattle hear Brahms, is that not worth doing? I mean, poor kids they want to be elevated too. They don't just want to be fed. I mean, who's to say that that's not just as good and just as important and just as noble an undertaking as, handing out clothing or food or something else? I think it's a fool's errand, really, to try to make some of those differentiations and to try to anoint and select certain sectors over others.
So I think many of us have probably seen the headlines recently about Wounded Warriors Project and that scandal. Do you think that stories like that affect people's willingness to give?
Sure, they do. Philanthropy is trust-based. It's basically self-policed. Not entirely. I mean, the IRS has a role too, but it's mostly self-policed, and it's really important that you don't violate that trust. So there are a lot of people that kind of jump up and down and get pretty exercised within the industry when something like the Wounded Warrior Project happens. The Wounded Warrior Project was less scandal than just sad, really. I mean, it wasn't so much guys, enriching themselves or something really horrible. It was just foolish. It was just, again, it became a big bureaucracy is what it really turned into. And that's what any institution will do if you let it. I mean, anyone who understands economic incentives, eventually the purpose of the institution becomes to justify its own existence and to pay its own salaries. And you sort of start thinking that that's the whole reason, the process got started. So that's another argument, by the way, for this radical decentralization I'm talking about. You avoid some of that sclerosis. But I think it is, I don't think it's at all inappropriate for people to really jump on the heads of charities to get out of line in cases like that, because the whole thing really is a trust-based industry, and if you don't police that internally, you'll basically get some congressman coming along to police it much less effectively from outside. Yes?
Could you comment a little on when philanthropy should not be involved? Specifically, I'm thinking about areas that markets could maybe do a better case and could serve more people. Sure. If we look at Tom's, for example, I mean, Tom's providing shoes for the poorest of the poor in the world is a great thought and a noble thought. Sure. But when you're putting the cobbler in those communities out of work in those local shoe manufacturing companies, there's repercussions there. So in your research, was there kind of a line between this should be philanthropy, and I know you've said you don't want to say this is bad and good, but when is philanthropy at its best?
Yeah, good point. The whole, I forget, was it here or was it, I've had such a day today. This is my third talk. I'm like trying to remember who have I talked to, who haven't I? But the food aid overseas is a classic example of a huge mistake. It's really easy and makes you feel good to just like send boatloads of grain to impoverished countries to feed them. But it's terribly counterproductive and perverse because you immediately basically put all the local farmers out of business. And what you really need to do is to help them become efficient and effective and supply their own markets. Otherwise, you're just setting yourself up for the next famine. So there are areas like that. And people are becoming wiser. That's beginning to be understood. And it's particularly being understood more by groups like, World Vision and Samaritan's Purse and some of the private donors than it is even by USAID, the public agency. But that's starting to sink in. But with some exceptions like that, I would say I'm a big believer in competition and in sort of different sectors rubbing up against each other and finding out what they can do well and what they can't. I must say, my own views on that exact question you asked, what is inappropriate, changed radically in the course of writing this book. I had no clue that national defense could appropriately be taken under the wing of a philanthropist. I had no clue that a lot of that major science could or should be done privately. I have a much broader definition now. Now, again, it has to sort of support itself. It has to turn it out to be the best alternative. And often what you'll get, of course, is a hybrid reaction. I mean, going back to that slide I showed about $39 billion of private donations for poor people overseas and 31 of official aid, what I didn't show there is actually there's two other chunks. There's 4 chunks. So you got private donations, charity, and then you got official government aid. Then you have overseas investment by private companies, which is hugely important because that actually employs people in there, and it's made on a very hard-headed, rigorous basis. People don't do it for soft-headed reasons. They do it because it makes sense to actually build a cement plant in Kenya this year. That's even bigger than either of those two sectors. And then the biggest sector of all is what's called remittances, where you got Kenyans and El Salvadorans and other people here who are working hard, and every month they send home money to mom or to their cousins back home. And that is probably the most effective anti-poverty work that comes out of America, is that family-to-family member private transfers of aid. So it's a whole kind of there's a whole interlocking directorate kind of ways to help, and the key is for each sector to find its own level and to not blend them. I mean, this is the really dangerous thing. Begin to homogenize them. I mean, especially you hear a lot about public-private partnerships. What that usually means is the charities and the government agencies get together, and everything is kind of homogenized to the blob. The blob kind of takes over. The least controversial, least inventive, least dangerous, least risky kind of strategies prevail, and you get kind of the worst of both sectors in some ways. So I think as long as you kind of keep each sector's role and sphere fairly separate, I think there's often room for multiple approaches.